Many years have passed since a fellowship of light battled the shadow creature at the Grey Haven. Now the heroes find themselves in an unknown land where they discover a man in black is wreaking havoc. Undeath follows him wherever he goes, and long-forgotten legends rise again, having been possessed by his evil. Join the players of this Dungeons & Dragons campaign as they attempt to stop the man in black as he collects artifacts both on and off the Lonely Island. Welcome to Tolkien in Part 2 of the Inglorion Bastards trilogy, Rise of the Mormon.
Okay, so that's the ritual. That's the background. Now, let's get to the actual and we can do rapid fire if you want. So this is, so we already talked about Pterodon. We've already talked about the Arkenstone. This concept that I sort of invented, which I thought was actually very Tolkien-esque, but you can tell me otherwise, was this concept of Durin's March. And so imagine Durin waking up up near Gundabad, and eventually sort of making his way down near Moria, the Mirror, and having this vision of the crown, and then, of course, erecting this statue. So what Durin's March was of course, not the actual trip that he did, but the path that I said followers of Durin would do as a pilgrimage.
Yeah. That's it's certainly in keeping with the attitude that we see from Gimli when he's looking into Mirror. I mean, I love it's a scene that you can easily kind of overlook in some ways, right? But you've got to remember they're actually being chased. The orcs haven't emerged yet, right? But I mean, they are in a chase situation where they have hordes of orcs behind them, and the only way they can be sure that they will survive, well, not even be sure, their best chance of survival is getting as far along the head start as they can during the daylight when the orcs aren't going to come out, right? And here's Gimli, who's like, okay, time out. I've got to go see Mirror, right? I've got some sightseeing to do. Yep. I'm gonna be right back, right? And I mean, and it's just that really kind of, it's not that Gimli has lost all sense of proportion, right? Or that Tolkien has lost track of it. It's you can really see, this means so much to me. He says, I cannot pass Mirror without turning aside. That is not, it's impossible. Go on about me if you have to, but I cannot. So that attitude that he has, is very much an attitude of towards a sacred site. I mean, it is clearly a sacred site. Yes. For Gimli. Even the way in which Durin's stone is there as, to commemorate the spot where Durin stood when he first looked into the Mirror, right? Again, it's a very pilgrimage sort of thing, right? And of course, your idea of the march is making me think of there have to be other sites, right? On Durin's March, there's got to be a well which was at the time yet untasted, right? Which here's a well which Durin tasted for the first time. Here's a dell which used to be nameless, but which Durin named.
It's like the Freedom Trail.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Sorry, it was the Gimli's poem is going through my head here. But I love that. I mean, I think that, it certainly seems to be the kind of thing that the dwarves would have held in lore, right? And again, certainly in keeping with Gimli's attitude towards that. The kind of reverence that Gimli shows really across the board for not only for the Mirror, but Moria itself, and even the particular kind of enthusiasm he shows about the Glittering Caves later on show, I think, the kind of attachment that dwarves have not just to these, but to places, right? Whereas you don't see, Legolas isn't like this, right? I mean, he likes Ithilien. He's really interested to see Fangorn, but he's not and he's heard stories of the Ents, right? He's heard stories of the Anodrim and their long sorrow, but he doesn't have the same fervor that Gimli does about visiting. I mean, he's interested in Treebeard, and he's really fascinated to see the Entwood, but it's not the same. It's not I've always heard stories about Ents, and now I get to see Ents for real. I can't wait. I have to go. But that's exactly the way that Gimli is about Moria.
I wonder if it's because of the amount of sort of carving out of Khazad Dûm, that the place connection that the dwarves have,
right. Whereas elves are happy just wandering hither and yon over the face of the earth, right? Yeah.
Okay, so we'll keep this. Maybe we'll do two more. Three more. One. This next one is something that I really enjoy, and it was actually inspired by The Adventures of Middle Earth from Cubicle 7. There's a creature in there called the creature in the well, and from that, like I just opened my eyes, right, and I did research about Ungoliant and where Ungoliant came from, and sort of, I mean, where she came from in the mountains, but then also sort of where she came from, and I started thinking, you know, Ungoliant is from this place in Aman called Avathar, right? These very shadowy mountains. So I used that name as a race. So we started referring by the second part of the campaign and the third part of the campaign, we started referring to the Avathari, because we have a character, I don't want to give too much away, but we have a character who is an Avathari, who ends up playing with us, right? And so this opens up all kinds of things, like maybe they're not all like Ungoliant, right?
Right.
So what do you think of that? Are there other references?
Well, so tell me more about the Avathari characters. So these aren't like monsters like Ungoliant. Are these are what, humanoids? Like, what are they?
Yeah, they could. So the character that ended up playing with us, the PC, had like an elvish form, right, that he took, so he didn't scare everybody. But there is a point which he sort of explodes into his Avathari form and scares the hell out of everybody.
Yeah, I would think.
So, but the whole idea is that, right, these creatures sort of crept out of the darkness while the world was being made.
Sure.
And maybe they didn't all have hearts of darkness, right?
Right.
I mean, is that even possible?
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, okay. So there's an indeterminate number of other spirits, right? We've got the Valar. You've got the Ainur, which is all of the spirits that were involved, right? You know, in the music and everything. But it's really clear that a bunch of them are very minor spirits, right? And especially in the Book of Lost Tales period, it's more clear than it is later on. You can still hear it. I think it's still how Tolkien thinks, but doesn't talk about it as much or in the same way. Where the Valar all have, like, their people, right? There's like a bunch of... So Manwë has a bunch of, like, air spirits who are his people, right?
His Maiar.
And Ulmo has a bunch of water spirits who are his people.
Yeah.
And so there's clearly a large number of lesser spirits, not all of whom are necessarily like on par with, say, you know, Olorin who becomes Gandalf, or the Balrogs, or something like that, right? There's like grades and levels in all of these things. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like Goldberry is also one of these folks, right? Somehow or other. So, anyway, point is, these folks are all over the place. Could there be some who are? Oh my goodness! I feel I'm all right. I will just use the word I'm uncomfortable using. Neutral. I'm comfortable using that because that's not a Tolkien concept, right? Except unless, I mean, you could say Tom Bombadil is neutral, right?
There's all kinds of theories about him, though, too, right?
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, spirits who are... So I can imagine, right? There were a bunch of other spirits who maybe they were Ungoliant's people, maybe they weren't actually, like, affiliated with her in the way that, you know, Manwë's spirits are affiliated with him or whatever. And they can kind of make their own choice. We know the Maiar can make their own choice, right? Like Saruman goes bad, Sauron goes bad, right? We know they can change their own paths, have the opportunity to repent, right? You know, Saruman had a chance to repent, didn't take it. So we know that the Maiar are capable, therefore, of, like, moral movement in this way. So Ungoliant had a bunch of minor followers, right? But she was a loner, right? And didn't, like, you know, build a community of them right down there in Avathar. So the idea that there would be lesser spirits who are kind of like Ungoliant in a sense, or sort of like spirits of Ungoliant, but who all have had their chance, you know, to make their own way. Could some of them have been... So what I meant when I said neutral was not servants of the Valar, right? Not servants of Morgoth and Sauron.
Right.
It's kind of floating around. There's plenty of examples of things like that.
So it's interesting. It's I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting that you talk so heavily about the Ainur, because the way I had always seen Ungoliant was that she was kind of outside of that somehow. Is that the wrong way to read that?
Well, I don't. First of all, Ungoliant is. I mean, we know almost nothing about exactly who she was and where she came from, and Tolkien's ideas about her kind of changed a lot over time. Gloomweaver is her coolest name, though. I mean, Gloomweaver, that is awesome. Yeah. But anyway, so based on the Ainur, right? The Ainur gives the impression that there's a Iluvatar, and he creates spirits, right? The Ainur, who are the offspring of his thought. Mm-hmm. So at that time, in as much as one can apply chronology to that, which I don't think you can, because these are the timeless halls of Iluvatar that we're talking about, but the way the narrative chronology goes is you've got, in the beginning is Iluvatar by himself, right? Then he creates, and when he creates these spirits. So now there's Iluvatar and there's the Ainur, right? Then the music of the Ainur happens, mm-hmm. and then Ea is created, right? Then he makes the world, and some of the Ainur, not all, go into it, right? And some of them don't go into it and continue just to hang out with Iluvatar in the timeless halls. So anything that is like a spiritual being, right? You could argue must have been one of the Ainur who descended in. Okay. But at the same time, I don't know. I mean, is it possible that there are some spirits at work in Middle-earth, resident in and at work in the world, which are in some sense a product of the creation of Arda? Mm. Now, like in creating Arda, he also, in giving, so like especially thinking back to what we were talking about, think of the parallel with the dwarves, right, that we were talking about, right? Aule makes the dwarves, and Iluvatar breathes the breath of life into them, except that's a biblical phrase. That's not what we get, right? The fire, the placing of the fire is the metaphor from the Silmarillion, mm-hmm. right? So he makes them live. He gives them souls, also not a big Silmarillion word. But that's also kind of the metaphor for Ea as well, right? The world is shaped according to the song of the Ainur, but it's Iluvatar who puts at its heart the secret fire, right, which burns there, mm-hmm. The flame imperishable. So in that sense, the flame imperishable is like the soul of the world, right, of creation, not just the globe, right, not just Arda, but the all of creation, all of material creation, right? Does that suggest, therefore, that in that action of saying Ea and making the world, Iluvatar also kind of created other spiritual beings within it, mm-hmm. right? That seems to me very possible, especially given that we see, even through the writing of The Lord of the Rings, the evidence of Tolkien thinking in very kind of animist terms about the world, right? That there are spirits living in things, like Goldberry, the daughter of the river, right? Mm-hmm. Like Carothros, the spirit of the mountain. And this gets cut out in the final version, but it's much clearer in the first draft. It's not just the rocks themselves that Legolas is hearing when he's passing through Holland, right? But the spirit of those places. And in the first draft, when Tolkien first wrote that scene, he doesn't say, "This land is unknown to me." He says, Legolas, that is, says, "The spirits of this land are unknown, are of a kind unknown to me." Like, these are like rock spirits, and I know tree spirits, because that's who I hang with, right? So I can't really talk to these guys that well. So this idea that the land is sort of, has a soul of its own, right? Has spirits that live within it on its own. It's an idea that you can see again and again in Tolkien's writing. So that is as much as to say, if you wanted your Avathari not to be Ainur, right, not to be spirits who descended into Arda with the Valar, alongside the Valar, whatever, even Ungoliant herself, as being instead a manifestation of like Ea itself, mm-hmm. I think there's theological scope available for that in Tolkien's world.
That's great. Well, Corey, I told you I was going to interview you for about 15 minutes, and it's been over an hour. And so,
that's all right.
So there's a bunch of other things on the list, and I was maybe we can do a part 2 at some point to this.
Sure.
But the one thing that I will sort of because I think we'll definitely agree with this. The one thing I want to touch on, it's really sort of, it has it's part and parcel to Tol Eressëa, is the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl.
Oh, the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl.
I mean, just that phrase is incredible.
It's incredible. And it's fun. It's almost never anything but that phrase. I mean, Tolkien brings up that phrase several times. Never tells the story of the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl. But it's like you don't even need to tell the story. You just say the phrase, the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl.
So do you have theories about who the sleeper is?
Well, no, not consistent theories. The closest, Tolkien didn't even suggest this. This, I think, was Christopher's guess in his comments, is that there's one version of the story when maybe it's Idril, right? Which is kind of a fun idea, in a sense, I think. But I don't know. I mean, because we never really find out what happens to Tor and Idril, right? They sail away, and we never know what happens. But the thing about the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl, you don't want the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl to sleep indefinitely, right? I mean, you've got, implicit, it seems, in the mythic concept of the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl is that there will come a day when the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl shall awake, right? When shall that be, and what shall be the occasion of that awakening, and what shall happen when the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl awakes?
Well, I answer that. I answer that in the podcast, so it's no problem. I got it taken care of.
It's one of those things. To me, it's one of the most classic examples of these kind of mythic ideas that float through Tolkien's early writing. And it's so rich with suggestiveness, but he never tells the story. Can I read one sentence out of the first chapter of the Book of Lost Tales, which is just, to me, especially if you go back, to a time, try to imagine a time when you've never even read the Silmarillion at all. So the name Earendel itself won't mean anything to you, right? Okay, I lied. It's two sentences. They're introducing, Vaire is introducing, folks in the house. Little Heart the Gong Warden is the one who's being, and I love Little Heart the Gong Warden, who's being introduced. And she says, he sailed in Wingelot with Earendel in that last voyage wherein they sought for Kor. It was the ringing of this gong on the shadowy seas that awoke the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl that stands far out to west in the Twilit Isles.
Yeah.
And almost everything in that sentence, we have no idea what she's talking about, right? What is Wingelot? Presumably a boat, but that's all we know, right? So who's Earendel? What's his ship? Why is it his last voyage? We know Kor, at least they've talked about it before, but we don't exactly yet know what it is. The shadowy seas, why are they shadowy, right? Where are the Twilit Isles, and why are they Twilit, right? And who's the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl? I mean, almost everything in that sentence is totally inexplicable, right? And yet immensely suggestive.
Just so rich, dripping with history, and Michael Drout actually has a lecture that I saw on this where he talked about how Tolkien would just throw out things like this, and you knew that people in the world knew what was going on, right? But the main character who knew the least maybe didn't, right?
Yes.
Yes. So it's interesting. So you talked about Earendel and the sleeper in the Tower of Pearl, and so all of these things are going to come into part two,
cool.
Including one of the other things that I thought was just so rich was the Caves of the Forgotten at the very end. So there's a lot to sort of look forward to. I touch on the Allure Male, which is really going to come into play mostly in part three, but there's just so many things to look forward to. The whole concept that I was going to talk about was the difference between Tyrion and Core Tyrion, at least in my story. Maybe I can ask you about this later at a different time.
Yeah, that'd be great. There's so much more to talk about there, but yeah, absolutely, it'd be fun.
Great. Well, is there anything you want to leave us with? I have to bring this up. I saw a picture on Twitter, and I kind of want to know about this. So I saw a picture of you at Mythmoot dressed up as Eminem.
Correct.
You got to tell me about that before you go.
So, we have Masquerade Ball at Mythmoot every year, and I dressed up as somebody, usually something from something I've been teaching about. So 2 years ago, I dressed up as Boethius in chains and, ropes. And last year, I dressed up as Jonathan Harker from Dracula. My wife came with me, and we were Jonathan and Mina Harker. We drew the red half moon on her forehead and everything.
The Keanu Reeves version?
Not quite so moving as the Keanu Reeves version, but anyway, yeah. So this year I dressed up as Eminem because I gave a talk on the prosody of Eminem at Mythmoot, and I was like, Eminem, that's a brilliant costume because all I need is a black hoodie. But anyway, no, it was great.
You pulled it off, man. It looked really good.
This has been like actually my recent kind of scholarly passion. Actually, is rap music. I have sort of discovered, as somebody who loves poetry and who loves, in Tolkien's phrase, the music of words, that is not just like music containing words or sung music, but the kind of music that the play of words itself has, the play of, and the relishing of the sound of words. And I've always been disappointed in 20th century poetry as a rule, especially poetry of the last 75 years or so. But I've recently I have lived through the entire evolution of rap music and missed it, basically. I've never paid a single bit of attention to rap music. And just, recently I just kind of stumbled across Eminem. And I was like, holy cow, like what this person is doing with language, like what he's doing with the sound of words. What he's saying is pretty dreadful, but what he's doing with the sound of words is absolutely amazing. So I was giving a talk on that, and I've been doing a lot of I've been doing a longitudinal study of rap music. I'm up to 1990 now, but anyway, so I'm from a poetic angle, I'm very, very interested in rap prosody and thinking about that. So my Eminem costume was very, but yeah, it was disconcerting, I gathered, for a lot of people there.
Oh, I thought it was you. The picture is perfect.
Yeah.
If you're up to 1990 rap music, then I definitely would recommend Tribe Called Quest.
Tribe Called Quest! I just listened to their first album from 1990 the other day.
It's incredible.
They're fantastic.
Yeah.
They are. Tribe Called Quest is now in my top 3 non-Eminem. Tribe Called Quest, Rakim, and Big Daddy Kane are my 3 favorite so far.
That was when I stopped listening to rap music back in the day. But we had my wife and I have had a resurgence with hip hop, although people would argue it's not really hip hop, with Hamilton.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's been one of the things that my kid loves Hamilton, and my wife loves Hamilton, and it's been one of the things that's been really fun. Studying the history of rap music is continuing to come across people, and I'm like, oh, okay, now I'm getting all the Hamilton references now that I never understood before.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, that was a Notorious B.I.G. reference. Okay, I get it now, right? It's a little slow in the uptake, right? Or like when I was like, anyway, there've been a bunch of things that I've recognized, and people. I'm like, oh, this person sounds kind of like Angelica Skyward. No, I mean, except Angelica Skyward kind of sounds like JJ Fad, actually. So okay, yeah.
Awesome. Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you about before I let you go was, and I promise I'll let you go, was a Colbert reference recently.
Yes.
So he took one of your courses, right? Or at least one.
He's listening through Exploring the Lord of the Rings, my Exploring the Lord of the Rings series. I actually found out years ago that Tolkien, he was listening to my Tolkien Professor podcast for a long time ago, actually, about 7 years ago. And this came about in a really funny way. One of my undergraduate students at Washington College, went to a taping of the Colbert Show. And, he used to come out and do Q&A with the crowd at the end of the shows, right? So this student of mine did her thesis on Tolkien with me. And so way back in the first couple years of my podcast, I did a couple sessions with students who did their thesis project to talk about their thesis projects about Tolkien. So Allison was the name of one of these 2 women with whom I did these sessions early on. And so they're doing the Q&A with Colbert, right? And she raises her hand and he calls on her and she asks a Tolkien question. And he answers her Tolkien question. And then he pauses and says, "Are you Allison?"
No way.
Because he recognized her voice.
Oh my God. From
the recording. And you can only imagine how she almost died on the spot, that Colbert recognized her voice and knew her name.
That's amazing.
But yeah, so he had just been listening to the episode where I talked with her, and so it was for him a bizarre coincidence that this person on the podcast he had just been listening to was there in his studio the next week. Anyway, so that was the first time I found out that he was listening to my podcast, but I hadn't known that was still happening until that article in the New York Times Magazine, that interview that he did a month ago. And when he mentioned that, and how that came to my attention, I was contacted by a fact checker from the New York Times Magazine.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, because Colbert said I'm about halfway through a 90-hour class on the Lord of the Rings, and so they contact me and they're like, "Is he exaggerating about the 90 hours?" And I'm like, "Oh no,
You have no idea.
He's not exaggerating at all." Like, in fact, we had just at that point recorded session like 104 or something like that.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm like, "Yep, no, not an exaggeration at all. I assure you."
Well, that's great. Well, see, Corey, you're reaching people.
It's always fun to see. And, the most rewarding thing I find about podcasting is, and again, this kind of brings it all the way back full circle to the beginning and what motivated me at the start. It has been, I've never regretted it. It has been so rewarding. Like Tolkien, my scholarly output has been much less than it might have been. I mean, I haven't written the scholarly books and articles that I might have done. But the number of times I've had the opportunity to hear from people, tell me about, what Tolkien has meant in their life and what the opportunity to dig in and discuss Tolkien and participate in my online classes or just, listening to the podcast asynchronously, and the kinds of stories that I've heard about the way in which, this has been, created an opportunity to really make a difference in people's lives. I mean, just last year I met this guy who was like, I had a serious illness and I was in solitary confinement for 3 months, and your podcast kept me sane throughout the solitary confinement and stuff. I mean, it's stuff like that you just get to hearing when you're kind of in the business for a while and interacting with a lot of people over a long period of time, and it's so rewarding. And again, that's exactly the kind of reward that I was looking for, that I was seeking, that I didn't feel like I was getting in the purely professional scholarly circumstances that I was in. And I have been, very, very happy with the results. It's been awesome.
Well, I'm going to continue to listen, and I know everyone else will too. So thank you again, and I will wish you good night.
Thank you.
Though this marks the end of the episode, the road goes ever on. Until next time, join us at longwinded.one and consider giving us a review on Apple Music, Spotify, or really whichever platform you choose.